Welcome, everybody, to Crystal, Kyle, and Friends. We are very fortunate to be joined this morning by Chris Hedges, man who scarcely needs an introduction, but he's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Of course, he was bureau chief in the Middle East and Balkans for 15 years, the New York Times, and host of the Chris Hedges Report on YouTube, which I highly recommend. Great to see you, sir.
Thanks, Crystal.
Yes, of course. So we wanted to dig into your knowledge and study in particular on the topic of fascism, which is extraordinarily uncomfortably relevant right now. And let's kick it off with current events. You wrote an extraordinary piece about the way that Charlie Kirk is being put into the role of a martyr and the way that this regime is using his assassination to consolidate their project. Now we also have this this ICE shooter that killed one migrant and critically injured two others in Dallas, Texas. What is this regime doing to make use of these killings?
So all radical movements are built on, quote unquote, the blood of martyrs. In the 1905 aborted revolution in Russia took its first Bolshevik, I forget his name, who was elevated to martyrdom. The 1905 revolution was kind of the dress rehearsal for 1917. Of course, the Nazis did it with Jost Wiesel, but this was true in El Salvador, the war I covered, and Bosnia, everywhere else. So why is a martyr important? Well, a martyr it becomes sanctified, and that was immediate, even before the suspect Robinson was apprehended. You had Trump declare him a martyr. You had the announcement that he would get the Presidential Medal of Freedom. You had the order to fly flags at half staff. You saw any criticism of Kirk and his positions, which included racist tropes and homophobia and Islamophobia and attacks on feminists and everything else, interpreted as condoning or celebrating his murder. People lost their jobs over this. So what does the martyr do? The martyr sanctifies the movement, any kind of negotiation, any kind of dialogue, any kind of attempt to understand the other side is a betrayal of the martyr, and the martyr justifies the acts of revenge, including violence, of course, in the name of what was done to the martyr, the sacrificial blood of the martyr. And that was instant. And that is really, I would say, the third phase of where we are. It began with the claims, the spurious claims that large research universities like Harvard or Columbia were bastions of anti-Semitism. I went to Harvard, I've taught at Columbia. The idea that they are fostering anti-Semitism is absurd. Not that anti-Semitism doesn't exist. And the universities acquiesced with this, in part because their trustee boards, especially at places like Columbia, have people that are very in tune with the Trump assault on education and free speech. So that was used, that in the name of anti-Semitism, you saw free speech shut down. Then you saw the demonization of undocumented workers, of migrants, that they're criminals and the prisons are being emptied. And of course, the truth is most of these people are working 14 hours a day, making maybe $14,000 or $15,000 a year. And that saw the massive infusion of money into ICE, which will include building detention centers all across the American landscape. And if anyone thinks that those are exclusively for undocumented workers or migrants, they are very naive. And then we saw this elevation of martyrdom of Kirk, which licenses the government to go after the radical left. Remember Antifa? And I'm no supporter of Antifa. Antifa and I have had their differences, especially during the Occupy movement. But there's no legal justification to charge Antifa or Antifa is an amorphous organization. It's not like it has a hierarchy or membership anyway, but that becomes a way to tar the quote-unquote radical left. Remember, the radical left is a fairly marginal force in American politics, relatively insignificant, frankly, but that will be used to go after liberals, George Soros, the Open Society, the Democratic Party, legacy media outlets, and you can charge them with terrorism in the same way that the UK government is using Palestine Action or supporters of Palestine Action, as they call it, supporting a prescribed group, which is basically what we call support for terrorism. So that's what this process is about. Kirk is a vital element of it in that kind of three-pronged assault that I outlined. And you saw, and that rally, the rally in Arizona was, I mean, it was kind of this Nuremberg-style rally with especially Miller's speech just being full-on fascistic.
He actually quite literally paraphrased Goebbels, as many people online pointed out. They showed the similarities. But that leads to my next question, Chris, which is, do you have a sense of how much the right is potentially overreaching? This is something that Crystal sort of brought up to me in the moment. She said, you know, they're really like out over their skis on this, and I don't know how much of this they're going to be able to effectively get away with, because it looks like what it is. It looks like an attempt to basically make this country a one-party state.
Well, unfortunately, the institutions tasked with protecting our democracy have completely capitulated. The Democratic Party, it really doesn't even function as a political party. Remember, the members of the Democratic Party have absolutely no say in its policies. 77% of registered Democrats want an arms embargo on Israel. 68% want a new leadership. It doesn't make any difference. Nobody wanted Kamala Harris. She was anointed by the party leadership and ran this vapid, issueless, celebrity-driven campaign. I really blame the Democrats for the return of Trump to power. If they'd run a credible candidate that had a vision, look at Mamdani or look at Bernie Sanders, Trump would not have gained power. But the Democratic Party is sold out. I looked at the last election as really a battle between the oligarchic class and the corporate class. And within the rubric of capitalism, corporatists want different things from oligarchs. Corporatists, they want a Biden or an Obama. They want decorum. They want stability, especially trade deals. They make investments overseas. It takes them a long time to see a profit, often after those investments. Oligarchs are different. They want chaos. They are a pure form of rentier capitalism in a sense that they put up toll booths between you and things you need: healthcare, education in our cities, water, sewers, parking authority, anything, and extract huge fees. They like insecurity, because then you have to live in gated communities and hire private anything. They want to privatize everything, and the oligarchs won. But that was really the clash within the last election. It wasn't between two competing political parties. It was between two aspects of capitalism. So I don't see, I think, you know, none of these totalitarian systems ever have majoritarian support. The highest percentage of votes the Nazis ever got was 37%. The Bolsheviks, and I think Chomsky's right when he talks about the Bolsheviks carrying out a counter-revolution in October. They, you know, constituted 1 or 2% of the Russian population. They destroyed the Soviets. These were worker councils that controlled the means of production, which is kind of what Marx was getting at. So they're never a majoritarian, but they use the mechanisms of state violence and state censorship to consolidate power. And that's precisely what's happening. What I fear is that we don't have much of a labor movement. The one movement that might be able to cripple the Trump administration and these Christian fascists, and just as a caveat, I'm a divinity school graduate, and I wrote a book about a decade ago called American Fascists, the Christian Right and the War in America. I look at these people as heretics. Jesus did not come to make us wealthy or bless the white race above other race or sanctify quote unquote crusades in the Middle East or anything else. So they function in the way the so-called German Christian church, which was pro-Nazi, functioned in Germany. So I don't know where the impediment is going to come from unless it's militant labor movements, and our labor movements have been decimated. And then you have figures like Sean Fain and others who have essentially sold out to the Democratic Party. So we're in really, really big trouble. You look back to the 1930s, the breakdown of capitalism. You saw militant movements, including the Communist Party. I'm not a communist, but it was an important aspect of our resistance And remember, there was a strong strain of pro-fascism, pro-fascist movements within the United States in the 1930s, and that really pressured the oligarchic class or the corporatist class embodied by FDR to bring us the New Deal, which has steadily been dismantled, of course, in the wake of World War II. So I worry that there isn't the regulatory power, there aren't the institutions that can thwart. But I mean, Crystal's right. I think most of us are not buying it, and most of us don't want it. But that may not make, sadly, any difference.
Mm.
Let me ask you related to that. So we had the whole Jimmy Kimmel situation, right? He tells this very mild, frankly, joke at the president's expense after Charlie Kirk's death. There's a big right-wing uproar. The FCC commissioner, Brennan Carr, comes out and threatens ABC/Disney, says, listen, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Also threatens some of the companies that own the local ABC affiliates, saying, I don't know why you're carrying this guy on your channel. ABC Disney buckles, Sinclair and Nexstar also buckle. Jimmy Kimmel is pulled off the air. Then there's a sort of consumer backlash, people canceling Disney Plus subscriptions, Disney stock price falls. There's some sort of, organic response to that where people are like, this is way too heavy-handed. What are you doing? A bunch of their talent and their artists sign a joint letter saying we're not going to work with you until you reinstate Jimmy Kimmel. And they did bring him back on the air. So I wonder what you make of that whole dynamic, because certainly, look, we're leftists. We're not under the illusion that like capitalists are going to stand up for democracy and, the will of the people and all those sorts of things. But it does seem like in that situation, they calculated that actually the upset from their artists and creatives and the general public was likely to be more costly to them than what the Trump administration might do in response.
Well, but you touched on a really important point, Crystal, and that is that he didn't say anything. What did he say? I listened to it 3 times. I mean, he kind of intimated that the shooter was, came out of the Maga universe, which happens to be factually true. What we don't know is the Robinson's motive if he was the shooter. We don't know because he's not cooperating. So we have no idea what the motive was. But he didn't really say anything. Nevertheless, of course, you have networks or distributors who are not going to run the Kimmel show. And I can guarantee you Kimmel's been read the riot act about what he can say and what he can't say. So that, may be a Pyrrhic victory. Clearly, Trump is weaponizing everything within the federal government to go after not just people who challenge his administration, but insult him personally. And there's it's a mafia. I mean, you see it with this tweet with Bondi to go get his detractors. Carl Polanyi wrote a great book called The Great Transformation. He was an economist, brilliant economist. And he talked about once you create a mafia economy, which is, of course, what we created, then you create a mafia government. And that's exactly what happened. But these people function like the mob. I mean, Trump talks like he's from the mob, even to the UN. Wouldn't read too much into the Kimmel, the return of Kimmel. He was sacrificed largely not for what he said, I believe, but because Trump didn't like him. Trump didn't like the jokes Kimmel made at his expense. Colbert's not coming back. So I think that in the larger trajectory, Trump is getting what it wants. Remember, Ellison, Trump's supporter, is about to take over CBS and appoint Barry Weiss, an arch Zionist, allegedly, is the head of CBS News, and he may buy CNN. So you have Trump supporters using their significant wealth to essentially buy up the media landscape, which is also part of what's happening in conjunction with this incident with Kimmel.
I'm curious what you view as the similarities and the differences between American fascism and, fascist regimes of the past, whether it be Mussolini's Italy or, the Weimar Republic, which became Nazi Germany. What do you view as like the same, and what do you view as uniquely American?
Yeah, Kyle, that's a very important point, because fascism never looks the same. And Paxton, in his book Anatomy of Fascism, he taught at Columbia, was a scholar in Weimar, makes precisely this point. And at the end of the book, he said that when fascism comes to America, it won't be with swastikas and jackboots, and it will be with the Christian cross and mass recitations of the Pledge of Allegiance. You really got a glimpse of that in the rally in Arizona or rally, whatever you want to call it, the memorial service for Kirk. So yeah, and Mussolini's fascism was very different from German fascism. The Germans went back and elevated this Teutonic myth. Mussolini looked back to ancient Rome. Anti-Semitism was never a strong element within Italian fascism. But there are characteristics, of course, of all fascist movements, but they clothe themselves differently. Our fascism comes in the guise of a Christian fascism. And as Paxton points out, the fascist movements always elevate very reassuring nationalist symbols to essentially give legitimacy to their movement. And the old Roman symbols were resurrected by Mussolini, for instance, in his fascist project. So yeah, fascism it mutates according to the culture that it's in. But the characteristics of it doesn't really have any kind of it's emotionally driven. It doesn't have any real coherent ideology. It is, of course, about hypermasculinity. It is about creating the ethno-nationalist state at the exclusion of everyone else. I mean, look, the Trump administration, if there was a black person in power in the Pentagon or anywhere, the Air Force, they were all out. He's gone. It's clearly racist, and of course, this was very much part of Kirk's project. The whole replacement theory and the need for white people to have more babies, and that is always, that ethno-nationalist drive is always part of fascism. And then, of course, constant mobilization against enemies, either internal or external. And as soon as you finish with one enemy, you have to turn on another. It's never ending. Fascists are very good at destroying. They're not very good at building anything. So yeah, that's a really important point, that it doesn't, fascist movements, while they bear common characteristics, are colored in different ways.
What about a comparison to the other so-called illiberal countries, Hungary and Turkey being the two prominent examples?
Yeah, or India with Modi. Mm-hmm. I mean, Modi's RSS is born. I mean, they quite the RSS, which was their militia, which preceded their political party, was copied directly from Mussolini's fascist movement. So, yeah, I mean, Hungary is a good example. Turkey's a good example. India's a good example. The great Indian scholar Pankaj Mishra wrote a very good book about this called The Age of Anger. So you have very similar assaults against, and I covered Pinochet's Chile, for example, assaults against universities, assaults against the press, the shutting down of rival political parties, the demonization, the rise of the ethno-nationalist state in India's Hindu state, a militant fundamentalist Hinduism, just like our fundamentalist Christianity, which is then used to demonize Muslims within India in the way that we demonize people of color and non-Christians in the United States. Yeah, there are many similarities. The difference would be, of course, Crystal, is that we're an empire, and empires have a different ecosystem. Empires, in some sense, and Alfred McCoy, the historian, writes about this, are fragile in a sense that their ecosystem survives because they have so many tentacles spread out all around the globe in order to ensure the sustenance of their economy and the perpetuation of their military machine. Empires, therefore, when they collapse, and this is true throughout civilization, come down or deflate quickly, with tremendous consequences because the ecosystem itself becomes unsustainable. The other thing about empires is they hollow countries out from the inside, which is what we've done. They destroy their urban centers or their cities first. And they use the mechanisms of control on the outer reaches of empire. So what is that? Drones, militarized police, wholesale surveillance, the abolition of due process. They use those controls. Those all migrate back to the homeland. We saw Thucydides writes about this in the Peloponnesian War, where he says the tyranny that Athens imposed on others, it finally imposed on itself. So it's a good analogy, except we are an empire, which makes us different from India or Hungary, and actually, of course, makes our situation worse.
What's your reaction to the Trump regime basically targeting outlets like ActBlue, for example, which is merely just the democratic payment processor for fundraising, or going after the likes of Media Matters, or, as you referenced earlier, George Soros? It seems to me like there's this attempt here to basically criminalize liberalism. Never mind leftism, just basic liberalism, and sort of equate it with domestic terrorism. And you see Trump now going after Letitia James, and you see him going after, James Comey and people like that. How do we put that into context and perspective?
Yeah, it's a good point, Kyle. The liberal institutions. Let's be clear. The liberal institutions are already bankrupt, and I wrote a book called "Death of the Liberal Class" about that. They mouthed a kind of boutique activism and abandoned the fundamental language of class war, and became despised because it gets into the whole thing with woke politics and everything else. So the liberal institutions discredited themselves. However, they remain, of course, a fierce opponent of Trump. Not so much Trump policies, but Trump's crudeness, his impulsiveness, his narcissism. He's an embarrassment to the empire. And that's the people around Biden and Harris and the Democratic Party. That's their primary objection to Trump. Anything that is a threat to Trump's complete and absolute grip on power. And let's be clear when we talk about Trump. Trump is very limited intellectually, of course, but the people around him, the Project 2025, this time around, they were prepared. They have a vision. They know what they want to do. And that is essentially destroy our democratic system. And the way they will do it is by neutering any institution. And you're right, Kyle, funding is key to essentially prevent any blowback or any threat to their consolidation of power, because we'll get back to the point that Crystal made, is they don't have majoritarian support. None of these movements ever have majoritarian support. I'm good friends with Julian Assange. And when they went after Julian, they cut down all his PayPal, all his money transfer services, and all his credit cards. He was in Sweden, he didn't got any money. He was completely broke. Did the same thing, by the way, to Paul Robeson under the McCarthy era. So funding is always a major target, and that's why they're going after it.
When you listen to a Stephen Miller or J.D. Vance, but I think Miller, frankly, is probably at this point more powerful even than J.D. Vance, the vice president, they speak in a language of complete victory, of complete, crushing defeat of what they call the left, but they mean like, Jim Comey and Gavin Newsom and anyone who's, left of center or opposes Trump in any sort of significant way. What is that like? What are they actually going? What is this project? What does the completion of this project look like?
Well, yeah, they're Manichaeans in the sense that the world is black and white. You saw, I think both Vance and Miller, if I remember correctly, used the word evil to describe the rest of us. The thing about these movements is that evil is always embodied in the other. And as a former seminarian and having been in war zones around the world, I understand that the line between the victim and the victimizer, as Primo Levi pointed out, is razor thin, and that the primary battle is evil, is our own capacity for evil. They don't look at it that way. They look at themselves as righteous and pure, and evil is embodied physically in other human beings. And in order to eradicate evil, those people have to be eradicated. That is how they view the world. That's how the Christian right views the world. That's how all fascist movements view the world. I would say all totalitarian movements. I'm not sure, Soviet movements were any different. And that's very dangerous, because when you lack that capacity for introspection, when you can't see your own darkness, and you believe that physically eradicating others is a way to purify the society, then you actually perpetuate your own evil and your own capacity for atrocity. That's why that rhetoric that you pointed out, Crystal, is so frightening and so dangerous, because it shows that totalitarian mindset. And as they become more frustrated, because their goal is unachievable, ultimately, they become more violent.
How do you think the media landscape, both mainstream media and independent/new media, how do you think they have contributed to the rise of fascism since 2020?
Well, Matt Taibbi wrote a good book on it, on the kind of media landscape, and he pointed out that it's different from when I began, in that the media is siloed. So the media caters to a particular demographic. The New York Times caters largely to registered Democrats, as does MSNBC, Fox News, Breitbart, Newsmax cater, of course, to the other side. But the problem with that is that they feed that their profit model is to feed that demographic what it wants, regardless of whether what they're promoting is true or not. And both sides are guilty of this, not just the right. So the New York Times put out the Caliphate podcast. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I'm an Arabic speaker. I realized, I think 10 minutes into it, that it was fantasy. They had the kind of snuff audio based, of course, on an imposter completely. They slogged the whole Russiagate conspiracy, which wasn't true. Trump was not elected because of Russia. Not that Russia probably didn't try to interfere, but that's not why Trump was elected. Of course, if we want to talk about foreign interference, we should talk about Israel. They did the, screams without words, I think was the title, alleging widespread sexual assault on October 7th against Israeli women. That turns out to be untrue. They don't pay a price for that, because that's what their readership wants to hear. And the inverse is true with, let's say, Fox News, who will peddle one conspiracy theory after another. That's really degraded the media landscape tremendously. You're reinforcing people's particular viewpoints, whether they're grounded in reality or not. And I would say both sides are guilty of that.
What would you say of the quote unquote new media landscape, of which Charlie Kirk was actually a part?
Right. So, okay, the new media landscape. There's always been an alternative media in the United States, and the role of the alternative media has largely been to shame the commercial media into doing their job. That's what Ramparts magazine did in the 1960s and this kind of stuff. Cy Hirsch broke Me Lie. He didn't break that for the New York Times. He put it out on a very obscure left-wing news site. So that's always been the role of the alternative media. It happens to be, of course, digital. You do it, I do it. I think it's been important, but we've certainly been targeted. I'm sure you have. I know you have. And I've been targeted, deplatforming and pushed out of this site and that site, and algorithms and everything else. But a figure like Kirk or Bari Weiss, it's different in the sense they do use that digital platform and that new media, but they're bankrolled by largely the Zionists. I mean, Charlie Kirk's budget was $80 or $90 million a year. And Max Blumenthal in the Gray Zone wrote this story I found very interesting, that he had, of course, his demographic, which are young Maga, are also alienated from Israel and disgusted with the genocide. And he never stood up for Palestinian rights or anything like that, so let's be clear. But he was giving space to people like Tucker Carlson, critics. And apparently the Zionists who provided him with substantial amounts of money, Bill Ackerman being high on the list, warned him that they'll pull the plug. There are media outlets on the right, but they have resources that we don't. And they're not targeted I think, quite as aggressively as we are. We still have a voice. We still have a place, which is important. And certainly, if the Trump administration is serious, as I think they are, about shutting down the radical left, then that space could vanish. They will go after the big institutions, the Democratic Party, the big media entities first. But I fear that when they finish with them, they'll come for us.
Hey guys, we spoke to Chris Hedges about the rise of MAGA fascism and how it's taking over the country. You definitely don't want to miss this episode. We go deep on what led to it and what to do now that we're in it. So sign up below on Substack and watch the full thing.